How y'all doing? I want to thank Mr. Wolf and everyone for inviting me back. And it was good to speak with y'all last time. I appreciate the opportunity to speak again. Last time I was here, I spoke to you about, to the Statesboro League of the South. I gave you a tool to defend yourself in advancing our goals. And that tool was the terms anti-white and anti-Southern. And I gave you a mantra you can use to defend yourself. And the last part of that mantra is anti-racist is just a code word for anti-white. And I hope you've been using that because these are powerful tools and they will make you a more effective advocate for Southern nationalism. I've been using them every day and I found that they work for me. I've also noticed that Dr. Hill is using these terms now, which is fantastic. The president of the League of the South is using them, and many other Southern nationalists. So today what I want to do is give you something else to make you more effective Southern nationalist advocates, but it's not a phrase, it's not a term. What I want to give you is a perspective or an understanding of our tradition, because you really don't hear it enough about this. I'd like to begin by sharing with you a short quote from Professor Alexander Dugin's recent book, this one here, The Fourth Political Theory. And I recommend that you read this. You can go on YouTube and listen to Mr. Dugan give all sorts of speeches. But he's not a Southerner, as you can probably tell by his name. And this is the English version of his name. He's a Russian. But he is an ally of us, of Southern nationalists, I would say. And a very fascinating and influential man. And his message meshes very well with Southern nationalism. Well, in this book, he writes about what he calls status quo conservatives, or liberal conservatives, which is a term which many would confuse many people, I'm sure. But I think that this perfectly describes the sort of conservatism that has a grip on too many Southerners today. And he writes, this is a quote, "It is liberal because it says yes to the main trend that is realized in modernity. But at each stage of this trend, it attempts to step on the brakes. Let's go slower. Let's not do that now. Let's postpone that. It's good that there is this free individual, but this free post-individual, that's a little too much." Dugan then goes on to say that the status quo or liberal conservatives are, quote, "in agreement with the general trends of modernity but disagreement with its more avant-garde manifestations which seem excessively dangerous or unhealthy." And a bit later he says that the status quo or liberal conservatives are, quote, "in agreement with the general trends of modernity but disagreement," well, I just read you that. He writes, "Liberal conservatives principally do not protest against these tendencies which constitute the essence of modernity and postmodernity." So I think that he's right. He's got a good point here if you think about it. Think about what these liberals or these so-called conservatives are actually defending, what they're actually conserving. It's typical in the U.S. media and the U.S. educational system or miseducational system to portray the United States as divided politically between liberals and conservatives, right? But with the North primarily being liberal and the South being primarily conservative. But many Southern nationalists actually use these terms too, unfortunately. If you go on Facebook, if you see what they write, a lot of us use these terms. And or a lot of people who think that they're Southern nationalists use these terms. U.S. liberals and conservatives, they're seen as opposites, and as each having distinct ideologies, and it's just not true. Professor Dugan, he makes the point that really they agree on the underlying principles such as democracy, equality, universalism, globalism, human rights, and so forth. They'll all talk about this. U.S. liberals just represent a more aggressive form of this, but U.S. conservatives are a slightly more restrained form of it, but they're arguing for the liberal status quo of America. They both fully accept modernity, as Professor Dugan says. They fully accept modernity and the values that grew out of the Enlightenment, which Dr. Hill has actually called the Endarkenment, which is fantastic. I think that's what it should be known as. Alabama Governor George Wallace, he famously said, I'm sure you've heard this quote a while back now, that the two U.S. political parties, he said that there's not a dime's worth of difference between them. And really, when you get down to their fundamental beliefs, he's exactly right. He's exactly right. Now, because we're Southern nationalists, we're pro-Southern, and most of us are pretty much against U.S. liberalism, I would gather, it's common to portray us as conservatives. And what I frequently hear Southerners, pro-Southern folks on the internet especially, describe themselves as such, as conservatives. What I want to do is demonstrate that Southern nationalists are not conservatives, and we've never been conservatives at any point in our tradition. You can take it all the way back to the very beginning. We've never been conservatives. And in fact, we've generally been fighting tooth and nail against the conservatives. They're generally our biggest enemies. And this is important for a couple reasons. One, it distinguishes our tradition. It carves out a place for our tradition on the political landscape. If we don't have a unique position, if we don't have something that we're advocating, what's the difference in us and the Republican Party? You know? So typically these days you'll hear U.S. conservatives, even many Southern conservatives, pining, sadly, for the days of George W. Bush. And for many younger people in particular who came of age in the Bush years, as well as many older folks who have a very short-term memory politically, and sadly that describes most of the United States. Bush is conservatism to these people. He is. So if you're against Obama, if you're against U.S. liberals, you must be for Bush, right? No, of course not. So that's what I'm saying. We need to carve out a place for ourselves. Now, are Southern nationalists George Bush fans? No, we're not. Of course not. And though we're few in number right now, we are actually probably the most consistent, or were the most consistent critics of the George Bush administration out there. Far more so than the liberals. Far more so. What I want to do is just consider three of George Bush's anti-Southern policies, just very quickly. In 2006, he signed a 25-year extension to the Voting Rights Act. Right? Under that act, Southern states have to get approval from the federal government to change our districts, to redraw our districts. Only the South. This is just one way that the South is treated differently than the rest of the United States. And several Southern states right now are challenging this at the U.S. Supreme Court. But we have to challenge it in their courts. Bush strongly supported this anti-Southern legislation, as did most Republicans. Most Republicans did. Self-described conservatives. Obviously, Southern nationalists oppose this. We don't want the federal government telling us how we can draw our own districts in our own states. Bush also started needless foreign wars. Needless foreign wars. Let me repeat that. And who did the fighting and dying in these wars? Disproportionately, it was us. It was our people. It was Southerners. Because unfortunately, we make up a huge part of the U.S. military. Fighting wars to make the Arab world safe for democracy, or for U.S. oil companies, or for the Likud Party, or AIPAC. This is not what Southern nationalists support. We certainly didn't want our young people sent around the world in George Bush's world wars. Now, the conservatives, George Bush and the conservatives in Congress, were also huge supporters of third world immigration. This is displacing Southerners in our own land. Big supporter of that, George Bush. This was part of what he called compassionate conservatism. in which he tried to get the votes of third world immigrants. So there's probably no issue, no single issue that Southern nationalists would feel more passionately about than being displaced in our own land. And in fact, this is probably our biggest goal right now, is to stop the ongoing genocide of our people. And it is a genocide as defined under international law. When you have a policy that deliberately replaces one ethnic, racial, cultural, or religious group with another, that's genocide under international law. These people could actually be tried in court for war crimes, for crimes of genocide, if we had the power to put them there. So Southern nationalists, we were not conservatives under George W. Bush, right? If conservatives are not pining for George W. Bush, sadly, they're typically invoking the glory days of Ronald Reagan. Rush Limbaugh does this pretty much every day if you listen to him. I used to listen to him for a while, and I've gotten tired. I know what he's going to say before he says it now. But conservatives, they look back on the Ronald Reagan years as a sort of golden age of conservatism. Now, this is the same Ronald Reagan who signed the Martin Luther King Jr. Day into federal law over the protest of the South. Is the same Ronald Reagan who put sanctions on the Afrikaner government in South Africa that ultimately led to the downfall of South Africa, and now which is ruled by the ANC. It's a communist, anti-white terrorist organization, rules that country now. There's an ongoing genocide of white people in that country right now. They're killing thousands and thousands of white people. Now, this was a stable, advanced Western country with far more of a traditionalist outlook on the world than the USA, and it was undermined by Ronald Reagan in part. So this is also the same Ronald Reagan who gave amnesty to 2 million illegal aliens. He actually matched Barack Obama in that respect. Barack Obama recently gave amnesty to 2 more million. So what's the difference, right? What of the South then? Was the South free under Ronald Reagan? You know, were we even treated equally to other states or other regions? No, we weren't. And we had no control over our own immigration policy of who moves into our land. So Southern nationalists, we were not conservative under Bush. We were not conservatives under Ronald Reagan. Let's go back a little bit further. George Wallace, I just quoted him a minute ago. He was a very popular Southern conservative in the 1960s and 70s. He won several Southern states when he ran for the U.S. presidency. He won every county in Florida, amazingly. That shows you the massive demographic change in Florida. Can you imagine a George Wallace winning every county in Florida today? No, but he spoke Alabamian. He did it well. There's some great YouTubes of him. Today Florida is divided between Obama and Romney, who they want to support. So yeah, it's incredible change that's gone on there, unfortunately. Now, there's a lot of good things we could say about Wallace. He was pro-Southern. He used our symbols unashamedly. He was not ashamed of our symbols. He stood up to the federal government. He quoted our great leaders. He attempted to prevent the feds from taking over our educational system. But as good as Wallace seems compared to Reagan or Bush or Obama or Romney, he was not a Southern nationalist. He was a conservative. Right? He wanted to maintain the status quo in the South at his time. And, of course, that status quo is a lot better than what we have today. But was the South free then? No, the South wasn't free. This is the 1960s and early 70s. The South wasn't free then. Could we control our own immigration policies then? No, they had recently signed a law which opened up the doors to the Third World, allowing millions of immigrants into the United States, into the South. Did we have our own media? We didn't have our own media. The media was far more controlled then than it is today. Today, at least, we have the internet. We can get out our own views. You have a lot more cable stations. There was a major war going on where thousands of Southerners were being sent to the other side of the world to fight in a war that had nothing to do with defending the South. Nothing at all. So Southern Nationalists were not conservative even in the George Wallace era. Now let's go back further to the Dixiecrat era. It was 1948, and these were Southern conservatives led by Strom Thurmond. Used to be my senator. They opposed federal intervention in Southern society, and they wanted to maintain the status quo of that era, right? They were openly pro-South. They used our symbols. They used our language. They quoted our leaders. Strom Thurmond, he won several lower South states when he ran for president that year, right? But again, was the South free then in 1948? No, the South wasn't free. It's sure the immigration system was better then. We didn't have third world immigration at that time. It was better. But it wasn't decided by the Southern people. We didn't have our own media then. We had just got through fighting a major world war in which tens of thousands of Southerners were sent all around this planet to fight for the interest of Washington, D.C. in a war that really had nothing to do with defending Georgia or defending the South. Our economy was centrally planned at that time, even more so than today. We actually had some of our people starving to death. And imagine that in a land as fertile as our land, as the South, people starving to death. That's tragic. We had that happen because of federal intervention in our society then. So Southern Nationalists were not conservatives even in the Dixiecrat era. We weren't. So let's go back 72 years before that. All right, let's go back to 1876, a very important year. That was the year that Reconstruction was ended in the South. It was the year that the Federal Army was withdrawn from South Carolina. They had, in 4 of our states actually, we had a white conservative minority take over the state power. In Louisiana and Mississippi and South Carolina and Florida, we actually had a white minority take over. That was pro-South. It was pro-white. In South Carolina, they were led by one of my heroes, Wade Hampton. He was a Confederate general and a holdover from the Old South. Right? Now, I could stand here and laud Wade Hampton and the Red Shirts, tell you all about them, how great they were, and they were great. I have tons of respect for them. In general, for the anti-Reconstruction forces in the South that fought against our occupiers. But let me ask you this. Was the South free in 1876? It wasn't free. We were allowed only a small measure of autonomy. That's all. Home rule is what we were allowed. More than what we have today after the Reconstruction was withdrawn. But we were not free. If you think about it, hundreds of thousands of our people were dead, having recently been killed by the United States military. Our cities were in ruins. They had recently been burned by the United States military. Our economy was ruined. We had massive starvation of people. A large part of our, you probably don't know this, but a large number of Southerners starved to death in that period. There just wasn't, there was no economy. In a land as fertile as this, imagine people starving to death once again. The South was a conquered land in that time in 1876. And my greatest hero, Robert Barnwell Rhett, he died that year of cancer. He had been leading Southern Nationalists all his life, and since 1828, he'd been leading the Southern Nationalist cause. And then he died in 1876. But on his deathbed, he wrote about how Southerners should refuse to cooperate with our conquerors and not help them put their chains on our body. He said that they have the power to force us to do what they want us to do, and that we should make them force us to do. We shouldn't do it just because they ask us to. And he thought that this would create a revolutionary atmosphere and would encourage resistance. And then after, he estimated about 30 years. He thought the South could rebuild in 30 years, and if we resisted enough, by then we'd be to the point where we could overthrow this outside rule, and the South would be independent again. He wrote, this is a quote from him from his memoir. He said, the people of the reunited states, South and North, are the heaviest taxed civilized people in the world, and their government, one of the most despotic and corrupt, staining its annals. Does not hypocrisy and contempt usually go together? And will the echoes of revolution throughout the land ever die away until the South is independent or the South is free? End of quote. So unfortunately, Southerners did not take Red's advice, generally speaking. Conservatives prevailed in that era. But you can clearly see that Southern nationalists were not conservatives even in 1876. How about if we go back to 1861? Some people will say, well, surely Southern nationalists were conservatives then. But after all, the South was independent in 1861. Actually, the Fire Eaters, Southern nationalists like Rhett, and this is a great book here on, this is a great biography of Rhett, The Turbulent Life and Times of a Fire Eater. And the same author, William C. Davis, has recently published Rhett's memoirs, which is fantastic. I just quoted from. But Southern nationalist leaders like Rhett and like William Yancey and Edmund Ruffin, who had worked for decades to make the South free. This didn't happen all at once. They were largely cast aside in 1861. Rhett, for example, he went from being a celebrity in Charleston. He could walk down the streets and people were toasting him. There were posters up on the streets in Charleston. He went from being a celebrity very briefly in the winter of 1860 to being cast aside, marginalized, and a bitter critic of the Confederate government. His life's dream, pretty much. At one moment he was thrilled, and then a few months later he was totally demoralized. The same thing happened to a lesser extent to Yancey and many other Southern nationalists. The men who had convinced the South of the necessity of independence were pushed aside, and the reins of the new Confederacy were given to moderates and conservatives like Jefferson Davis, who had opposed secession, or people who had just only embraced it once it was inevitable, once the majority of Southerners had finally come to support it. Southern nationalists, they did all they could to help the South win the war, but they fought bitterly against the Confederate government. In fact, Rhett was probably more strongly criticized Richmond than he ever criticized D.C. They fought against the Davis administration on everything from trade policy to military plans to even the symbols used to represent the Confederacy. Now, if you think about it, the capital of the Confederacy was put as close as they could possibly get to Washington, D.C., to the U.S. Capitol. Think about that. It was moved from the lower South as close as they could get to Washington, D.C. The flag of the Confederacy, the first national Confederate flag, was essentially a modified version of the U.S. flag. Notice that George Washington, the first president of the USA, he was right at the center of the Confederate seal, his picture right there on horseback. The Confederate Constitution is basically a carbon copy of the U.S. Constitution with minor changes. 6 years for a presidential term instead of 4, so forth. But Southern nationalists were not conservatives even in 1861. They had a very different vision for the Free South, very different. Now, let me quickly go back to 1828. The South was wealthy, confident in 1828. It was a great time to be Southern, probably. The U.S. federal government was a minuscule nuisance at worst then compared to what it was a few decades later, much less in the modern era. But were Southern nationalists conservatives in 1828? No, they weren't. The South was locked in a bitter dispute with the North over the tariff, which taxed Southerners to build internal improvements in the North, because the North controlled the House of Representatives, so they could spend the money as they wanted to, basically. This tariff protected Northern industry at the expense of Southerners. We paid for it. Our prices were higher. Now, our region was far wealthier at that time than the North, far wealthier. There was no comparison. This was one of the wealthiest places on earth at that time, the South and Georgia. This is one of the wealthiest societies in the world at that time. Think about that. But the South, John C. Calhoun, for example, who was a Southern conservative, he opposed secession. Much more radical than most conservatives today, of course, but a conservative nevertheless. He compared Southerners of that age, who were wealthy people by and large, to slaves, because he said that we were toiling away for the benefit of Northerners. Nor was the South able to expand evenly to the North as we went west, and that ensured that eventually it was inevitable that the North was going to have more states, so therefore they'd have more representation in the Senate, and they would win all the presidential elections. So this would ultimately doom the South. And Southern nationalists like Robert Barnwell Rhett, they were primarily at that time confined to the low country of South Carolina, around Beaufort and Charleston and all. But they did their best to try to convince Southerners, especially South Carolinians, but also Georgians and others in the lower South, that staying in a union such as the United States was folly, where Southern interests are pushed aside in favor of Northern interests. Southern nationalists also pointed out then that they were locked in a union with a people prone to fanaticism, and that was a common description of the Yankees at that time. And Rhett and many other Southern nationalists, they talked about the tendency on the part of Northerners to take up one social crusade after another. And they were right about this. And this fanaticism, as I've already sort of mentioned, it came from the values of modernity, which came from the Enlightenment, which Southern nationalists and even Southern conservatives in that era rejected. Now, a few years later, the USA showed its true colors during that tariff dispute and pushed through a force bill which gave the feds the power to use military intervention in the South to collect the tariff. Now, Robert Barnwell Rhett, this prompted him to say, quote, "Do you tell me of union when I have seen the cannon of ships and fortresses pointed at your towns, and the insolent soldiery of an angry tyrant lording it in your streets? I cannot love, I will not praise that which under the abused names of union and liberty attempts to inflict upon us everything that can curse and enslave the land." That was the voice of a true Southern nationalist in 1828. So the Southern nationalists were not conservatives even back then, even in 1828, going way back. Let's look at one more point here. Look at the establishment of the U.S. Constitution, which conservatives today practically worship and revere above all else. I think even above the Bible. But Southern patriots of that era, like Patrick Henry, said that they smelled a rat in the U.S. Constitution, a document that's been called Hamilton's Coup or Hamilton's Curse, and I recommend the book by Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo, Hamilton's Curse, about Alexander Hamilton, great centralizer of that time. But the U.S. Constitution centralized power in a federal government to a much greater extent than did the Articles of Confederation, which you probably know about. And the Articles were hated by Northern finance and Northern industry because they didn't allow for a centralized state to be created. Now, we've seen the results of Henry's rat today. We've seen the results. And as some of my libertarian friends say, and I'm not a libertarian, but as some of them say, you know, the U.S. Constitution was either created what we have today, or it was unable to stop it. But either which way, it was worthless. It's a failure. And Rhett pronounced it a failure in 1828. So even in those early years of the United States, right after the Constitution was found, Southern nationalists were not conservatives even then. One final point, this is something that I'm researching now, and this is a good book on that subject if you're interested in the concept of the Golden Circle. This is the South Carolina and Barbados connections, and I've got tons of articles on Southern nationalists. If you go to southernnationalist.com, I've got this is pretty much all I've been writing about for the last 9 months or so. But this is for a new book that I'm studying now. But even the American Revolution, celebrated as it is by everyone in the United States on the left, right, and in between, it could be seen actually as an anti-Southern movement, really. It severed the mainland South from, which was plantation societies, from South Carolina to Delaware. It severed these from the plantation societies of the Caribbean, and one of which, Barbados, had actually colonized the lower South. It had actually colonized South Carolina, starting at Charleston in 1670. So this division of what Southerners in the 19th century called the Golden Circle, this division doomed both the mainland plantation societies and the Caribbean plantation societies ultimately in the long run, because they shared actually a common culture and a common social structure for the most part. And I know that this is a point that would be more controversial, but if you'd like me to, I'll come back and talk about it with you another time. But as you can see from the foundation of the United States to today, Southern Nationalists, we've never been conservatives. We never have. I hope I've pointed that out to you. We've always been at odds with conservatives who've always wanted to preserve the status quo. The modernist values and social orders we have today based on democracy, equality, universalism, which we suffer under today. Look what it's done to the South. These values, democracy, equality, universalism, look what they've done to us. Destroyed the South. So we Southern Nationalists, we have our own tradition, and it's distinct. It's not status quo conservatism or liberal conservatism, as Professor Dugan calls it. We're not U.S. conservatives. We're Southern Nationalists. And this society that we live in today, this set of values that we live under, we don't wish to preserve these values, this sort of society. We're not looking northward to Washington, D.C. and the U.S. Constitution and the federal government. We're connected actually to an entirely different tradition based on a different civilizational model and a completely different culture and a value system. So in closing, let me just briefly quote Robert Barnwell once more, the father of Southern nationalism. And this is a great quote from Rhett. He says, "The Star-Spangled Banner no longer waves in triumph and glory for me. If a confederacy of the Southern states could now be obtained, should we not deem it a happy termination, happy beyond expectation, of our long struggle for our rights against oppression?" Thank you.